talk mainly about Strata and the opportunities for reducing emissions in the high-rise residential sector. But firstly, I just wanted to touch a little bit more broadly on what the City of Sydney is doing in the energy efficiency and renewable energy space. So is everyone here from the City of Sydney area or people from outside? Okay. So the City of Sydney itself, about 200 residents, but up to 1 million people visiting daily. So really important that we engage with people who are coming in and out of the city. Obviously, many thousands of workers and significant number of businesses that we need to engage with to try and reduce our local government area emissions particularly. Just really briefly, in terms of targets, the city has a range of targets to reduce the environmental impact of the local government area. Most ambitiously, net zero by 2050 target. So obviously that's an ambitious target and a long-term one, but something that we're really committed to setting a pathway towards. Also aiming to not increase the use of potable water by 2030, and that's in spite of the obvious population increases that we're going to be experiencing. And a lot of focus on reducing waste to landfill as well, to make the city more climate resilient, green and cool, and also a lot of focus on active transport and connectivity as well. In terms of how we're going with that, well, on the whole across our local government area, we are seeing that carbon emissions are falling. However, clearly not fast enough for us to meet our 2030 or 2050 targets. So we're really in the position of, at the moment, of trying to work with different sectors of the community and of the built environment to accelerate that action, so we can actually reduce that energy use and accelerate the move towards renewable energy more quickly, so we can actually get to those targets. So whilst it's positive that the emissions are going down, there's certainly a lot more we need to do. And that's really why we take quite a partnership approach to working with industry and representative bodies, but also different sectors of the built environment to see what we can achieve collaboratively. Really briefly, in terms of where our focus is currently in achieving our emissions reduction targets by 2030, obviously most of our effort at the moment is in this energy efficiency and renewable energy space, so working with buildings to improve efficiency, reduce their energy use, and then helping them to transition across to renewable energy, whether that be on-site or off-site options. But obviously the education and the capacity building in that space is different for each sector. And high-rise residential communities, for example, may need different tools and resources and support than commercial office buildings. So for that reason, the city actually is taking a sector-based approach. So we have different strategies and programs that work with different sectors of the built environment, and they've been identified clearly because of their environmental impact. So we've looked at where are the emissions mostly generated, where's the water mostly used, etc., and tried to develop a series of sector strategies that are targeted specifically to the needs and the barriers of that sector. So we have people concentrating on all of the accommodation and entertainment venues, so working with hotels, venues such as the Opera House and the museums on what they can do. We have another team working with commercial office buildings who are doing really well actually. You may have heard of the success of the Buildings and the Better Buildings Partnership in reducing their emissions. And then the team that I'm a part of, we're concentrating on the residential apartment sector. So how can we work with strata communities to collectively reduce their environmental impact? And again, that's really because apartment buildings are around 11% of the emissions that we see in the City of Sydney, and over 40% of the water use. So it's a really important sector for us to focus in on. Also important in terms of the fact that 80% of our residents actually live in these communities. So as a local government, we have a responsibility to work with them to improve the environmental and the cost efficiency of their buildings. So mainly tonight I'm going to talk about what we're doing in that residential apartment space, what we're seeing in terms of the opportunities, what the data's telling us, and some of the challenges that we're experiencing in working in that sector. Does anyone live in an apartment? A few people, okay. Does anyone own an apartment? Okay, all right, great. So feel free to share your own experience or anything that you might have learned in going through a similar process in your strata community. First off, just really generally, what we're seeing at the city in terms of residential sector emissions, and clearly this isn't just apartment buildings, it's houses as well, but mostly apartment buildings. We are seeing some reduction in emissions when we look at where we've come from since 2006, but it's slow. And again, I'll just reiterate that point. We really need to work out how can we work with other partners to accelerate that. And with the population increase expected by 2030, it's to be quite significant. It's something we really, really need to tackle, and we need to tackle it quickly. And the good news is some of our programs, like Smart Green Apartments, which I'll talk to you about, and like grants, which I know, Marissa, your building's been through as well, are giving us really important data and case studies on what actually does work. And I think our challenge now is to amplify that and to integrate some of these projects and processes across buildings more broadly. So, to do that, I won't talk too much about strategies, and I'll get into the nitty-gritty soon, but to do that, essentially, we've got an approach where we're working with existing buildings, which is in these three areas, to get upgrades happening, whether that be efficiency upgrades or transitioning buildings to renewable energy options, but also simultaneously to build the capacity of owners of apartments and the other professionals that work in that sector, like building managers and strata managers, to really understand what's going on in their building from an energy and water use perspective. So a lot of training and capacity building initiatives there. And to empower communities to make better decisions. A key element of that, you may be aware, is that a neighbours rating for apartment buildings launched mid last year, and that's we see that as a really key tool to allow apartment owners corporations to actually understand what's happening in their building and to make decisions for the future. And we're also working with new buildings. So what can we do from a planning perspective to increase the quality of new builds? And how does that work when we advocate to state government particularly? Also, how can we foster innovation? How can we get some of the leaders to really go above and beyond and demonstrate that sustainability innovation in the design and construction space? In terms of what we're aiming to achieve in the residential apartment sector at the City of Sydney, this area here is mainly what I'm going to talk to you tonight about. We have a program called Smart Green Apartments that goes into strata communities, apartment buildings. They apply to be part of that and delivers energy audits, gives them neighbours ratings, works with them on training opportunities, installs monitoring platforms and the like. So basically a really extensive support program to help identify energy and water saving opportunities, and then also to implement them as well. So mainly I'll be talking to you about that, but I guess I just wanted to point out that some of our direct action initiatives like Smart Green Apartments or like our grants program, they're really important and we will get emissions reduction from them, but in some ways they're even more important from the perspective of the data and the case studies that they're going to give us to advocate for changes more broadly. So as I mentioned earlier, we do have a neighbours rating for apartment buildings. We really need that to become mandatory for those to be disclosed. So by gathering all this data and this and the knowledge of the impact that our programs on the ground are making, it gives us the credibility and the evidence base to advocate to other layers of government for that to actually become a mandatory disclosure. Okay, so just really briefly on apartment buildings, and some of you will know this if you live in a strata community. I think what's happening more broadly is apartment buildings are growing rapidly in terms of what is really the face of home nationally. It's not necessarily going to be the single unit dwelling anymore. More and more people are living in high density residential communities. And these communities have a really complex ownership structure. They're governed by acts of legislation, which are obviously different around the country, and decisions need to be made in accordance with those, even when it comes to sustainability upgrades. So there's that layer of complexity in terms of decision making and approvals that perhaps other areas of the built environment don't have. And there's a lot of social, cultural and sustainability challenges within some of these large high-rise residential communities. And for us, as the City of Sydney, it's where 80% of our residents live. So it's a really important sector for us to be engaged with. This is actually a slide stolen from Chris sitting at the back there, but our challenge actually has also been to advocate and make people more aware, even at a policy-making level in state and federal government, that apartment buildings are not a series of houses stacked on top of each other. When you buy into an apartment building or a strata community, you're buying the airspace within your individual lot, within your individual apartment, but you're also buying a share in common areas and shared services. So you're responsible collectively for making decisions on what happens with those common area plant and equipment and how they're managed. And potentially that's something a lot of people probably aren't fully aware of the implications of when they purchase an apartment. And that can be quite complex. We have people who might buy a $1 million apartment in the City of Sydney and then are collectively responsible for managing a complex $60 million asset. And so there's a real need for capacity building there around how to do that well. And I guess the other thing before we get into the data of what we're seeing from an energy perspective, these decisions aren't made in a vacuum either. There's a lot going on, and I'm sure we've all heard of the issue with defects, the Opal Tower scenario that happened recently. But also, there's a lot of different issues that people in apartment communities are facing, and any decisions around sustainability upgrades are made in the context of all of these other conversations that are going on. And quite frankly, people are acting in a volunteer capacity to make these really complex and often technical decisions. So we as council see a real role for ourselves in capacity building and training programs for owners, strata managers and residential building managers. On the positive side though, there is a readiness for change that we're seeing in apartments in the City of Sydney. Building managers, residential building managers are often there are not as many training and capacity building opportunities on offer for them, perhaps. We've recently launched our second iteration of a really substantial sustainability training program for those building managers. And also we're seeing our strata managers start to think, well, what can they offer their owners corporations in terms of differentiating themselves in the market? And that could be an ability to navigate through processes around energy efficiency and renewable energy. And I guess the most important thing really over the last year is the fact that there is now a star rating tool, an independent star rating tool, a NABERS rating for the apartment buildings across Australia, which is making things more visible and really giving strata communities a place to start to benchmark performance and to plan for the future. So that's extremely valuable. And obviously everyone is aware of NABERS, but in terms of apartment buildings, for most of our buildings that's looking at the whole of building water use. Many of our buildings have only one water meter. And then from an energy perspective, it's looking at central energy services, or rather anything that's paid for collectively by the owner's corporation. So it's really giving that snapshot to make better decisions into the future. Okay, what we're seeing, well, over the last 3 years, from 2016 to now, our Smart Green Apartments program's worked with over 10,000 apartment buildings that represent over 10,000 individual homes, home to 22,000 residents, over 133 buildings and 106 strata plans. So basically that slide's just trying to illustrate we've worked with a lot of apartment building owners and buildings over the last 3 years, and earlier than that in previous iterations of the program. So we're starting to gather a lot of data about what's possible. What we're looking at in Smart Green Apartments particularly is, from an energy perspective, is the common area energy use of these large apartment buildings and how we can tackle reducing that energy use. So what we're actually finding is that in the larger apartment buildings, the energy used within apartments can be around 40%, and the energy used by common area plant equipment can be up to 60% of the building's total energy use. So it's really important that we tackle that. And from our data, we're seeing that this is where the common area energy use is broken down. So still a lot of lighting energy use and HVAC, of course. But in terms of what we're seeing about the potential for savings, each year we're identifying amongst the buildings that take part in our program that there's average cost savings of around 35%, and every year consistently we're seeing average energy saving potential of 30%. So, and that's through projects with really simple projects, often lighting, mechanical services projects, and renewable energy projects that are quite simple, and the first two generally having a payback period of between 1 and 3 years. Obviously the solar payback periods are longer than that. And what's interesting actually compared to some of the other sectors that we're working in at the city is there's still a lot of opportunity in lighting. We're not seeing that as much obviously in commercial office and other sectors, and a lot of opportunity in the mechanical services, so in terms of the tuning of fans, motors and pumps, and obviously the installation of variable speed drives. In terms of what we're hearing from apartment owners and how they're feeling about tackling sustainability upgrades, there is a perception that because they don't live in a house, there's not as many options, rebates, programs or initiatives out there that are tailored to what those strata communities need. And some of them don't actually understand what we just spoke about before, that there's two parts to an apartment home, the lot itself and the common area, and any offering needs to understand that and to be assisting with that. And when it comes to things like solar, it's more complicated. How do we go about putting that on a shared roof, for example, and where do we go for information and support on that? So that's what we're trying to do for apartment buildings within our local government area, provide that support and assistance. And I think what we're really seeing is that there's consistently quite a lot of opportunity when it comes to solar on our apartment buildings. We are also obviously encouraging buildings to do those energy efficiency initiatives first. Obviously the energy you don't use is the cheapest energy, but many of our buildings are now starting a journey, if you like, an energy journey, where they're getting a neighbour's rating, they're seeing where they're at, they're starting to do those more low-hanging fruit options in terms of lighting and mechanical services upgrades, and then moving into renewable energy. This is a bit of a text-heavy slide, but the impact's quite large as well. When we look at the buildings that we've worked with over the last 3 years, the average system size of a solar system that we've identified is reasonably large. There's a significant impact if we get 1 or 2 or 3 of those projects over the line. However, the collective decision-making processes in those communities does make the implementation of those projects a little bit more difficult at times. And certainly something that we have to be aware of when we're working with those communities, whether it be in government or as suppliers, that there is a legislatively governed approvals process that we need to go through to get modifications to common property approved. There's also considerations around what are those roofs used for? Are they active roofs? Are they used for recreational purposes? What's the best outcome for that strata community as a whole? Is it in fact putting solar, or would they be better off purchasing green power, for example? And I think I just wanted to illustrate the point that those decisions need to be made in terms of what's best for that community as a whole. So, I might skip over that one, but basically I've got an error that I forgot to change, and this bylaw has actually been changed. But what that slide's actually trying to illustrate is the fact that when we look at apartment buildings, and some of you might be aware of this already, there's kind of 2 options when it comes to solar installation. So, and what we're trying to do mostly with our larger buildings is install solar for common area energy requirements, so solar that powers some of that common area load. And that has one approvals process, so they need to get a special resolution at an AGM of their owners corporation. But obviously solar can also be installed to service the needs of an individual apartment or an individual lot, and that requires a different approvals process. It requires a bylaw to be introduced. And different buildings will go down those different pathways dependent on their energy load, the height of the building, the relative surface area of the roof space. So we'll often see buildings who are, smaller six-pack kind of apartment buildings might, they've got a smaller common area energy load, so they might pursue going for solar for individual lots. But to be really honest, most of what we're working in is this top area. How do we get them to install solar for their common area purposes? We recently did quite a significant research piece with owners, strata managers and building managers looking at, well, what are their attitudes when it comes to solar, renewable, green power and the like. Are they aware of what the technical solutions are out there? Are they aware of what their options are and what the positive impacts of those are? And it's been really interesting actually to see what their motivations have been. So we are really seeing there's clearly a financial motivation for apartment communities to install solar, but there is an environmental motivation, and most interestingly, I think some of this stuff around self-sufficiency or energy independence, like we're hearing that consistently through our research projects and also anecdotally that independence from the grid, or that reducing their reliance on energy companies and their impacts from rising energy prices is a real motivator for them. But the barriers are quite extensive. We talked earlier about the competing use for roof space, but competing priorities as well, that collective decision making, and Marissa and I spoke about this earlier too, that collective decision making process is difficult, and really articulating the benefits of renewable energy across an owners corporation is hard, and pitching it in a way that people can see the long-term effects of not acting is really important, because a lot of our buildings are saying, well, there's a high capital cost. Yes, but what are the implications of not reducing our energy use or pursuing renewable energy options, and encouraging owners corporations to consider it in that context as well. But the other thing I think that we're seeing is that there's a lack of information on how to proceed, and the information that is out there is not tailored for the strata sector. So that's where we're starting to really try and develop tools and resources that are tailored for apartment owners, that we hope other councils and governments and strata communities will start to use as well. In terms of green power, look, on the whole, we're finding that there's a knowledge of something kind of like green power out there, and people will say, yes, I've heard of that. Whether there's a specific understanding of what it is, I highly doubt. And there's, I think, definitely confusion around it. We need to do more work in translating what that actually means for owners corporations. And, obviously, clearly, the big barrier is cost to owners corporations around green power. And I think, again, articulating what the co-benefits of purchasing green power are is really important. For example, the positive effect it could have on an apartment building's neighbours rating. I thought this was interesting too. Recently, in this research project we did, the City of Sydney is looking at how to develop new tools to help all residents, workers, businesses to go along the journey towards net zero. And some of the things that apartment owners told us in that process was assistance is really important, clearly, and online assistance and online and over-the-phone assistance is of limited use. Each of the apartment communities we work with are so varied and complicated, often with really complicated metering arrangements as well, shared services with commercial offices or retail spaces, that they need face-to-face advice and on-site advice on what's actually best for their building, and those feasibility studies from an independent source, which is, I guess, where the City of Sydney is trusted in that space and trying to provide that, but also some practical tools to get it implemented. So, RFQ templates and guides to help them to know what to ask for when putting quotes out to suppliers. How do they know that a supplier is good or experienced in the strata sector? So all of that advice is really important. I won't dwell on this too long, but it was interesting to see with strata managers, they actually can't make any decisions. They're an influencer in this space, but they're an important influencer, and we really need to work with them to engage owners in apartment buildings to consider these things, to consider renewable energy, but also energy efficiency. And some of the things they pointed out as barriers that they're observing on the ground are this constant fear of technology obsolescence, which I found really interesting, that they're hearing from owners that they're really worried about installing solar this year because what if the technology's extremely improved next year, which is kind of interesting when we know that it hasn't changed significantly for the past some time. So it's about saying, you're fine, you can act now, but there's no sense of urgency around making that decision. So that's something that I think government has a role in looking at where rebates or incentives that push that decision over the line can come in. Also, there's a lot of interrelated discussions, which I know we'd all be hearing, around other things going on in apartment buildings. What about battery storage? How does this link in with electric vehicles? So I think it's just an important reminder that we need to link our discussion with solar in with those other emerging issues. And the other thing I'll mention briefly, that strata managers were largely unaware of the positive impacts that purchasing green power can have on an apartment building's neighbours' rating. So obviously if an apartment building chose to purchase 100% green power, they're going to go immediately up to the top of the scale when it comes to a neighbour's rating, and that, for some of our luxury buildings, might be something they're really keen to promote. So tying in those co-benefits and that market differentiation is really important. Building managers are basically saying that what they're experiencing from their engagement with suppliers and people around solar in the sector is logistics issues. So issues around, curved roofs, roof membrane replacements, how does that work when it comes to solar? So they have a lot of questions around that side of things, some of which are quite simple to address, and others that, potentially there's a resource gap there that we need to address for them. And often, and this is just coming from our research, that there are often inconsistent advice from suppliers with regards to solar in strata, which is interesting. And they're, obviously again as an influencer, so they're trying to influence the owners, corporations to perhaps consider some of these projects, but clearly a really common theme was, some of these decisions, unlike perhaps in commercial buildings, aren't made entirely based on logic or rationality, that there are feelings involved. These are people's homes and perhaps their single greatest personal investment. So the way we engage and communicate around renewables, for example, needs to be cognizant of that. In terms of going forward to net zero, this is kind of where we are at the moment. We're working on the ground. We're trying to implement and increase uptake of the neighbours rating tool in this sector, which is it's actually been the fastest uptake of any neighbours rating across any sector, which is amazing. So it shows that there's an appetite for tools that help increase visibility around decision making, and working at engaging with our state government colleagues at how can we get policy uplift there as well, using the data we have on this sector. How can that influence policy and legislative change at a state and federal level? But going forward, our big advocacy objectives are around advocating for mandatory disclosure of those neighbours ratings into the future, which we really believe, and it's modelled that will drive improved performance. But also looking at other ways that we can transform the market. How can we work with partners, with industry bodies, with suppliers to really accelerate that uptake, but in a way that's cognizant of the complicated approvals processes that are in place and the specific needs of apartment building communities. And clearly, working to actually set roadmaps and incentivise that pathway to net zero, whether it be through on-site renewable options or off-site options as well. So what does that look like for apartment buildings? And I don't think we're quite there yet. and really looking at how can we use the data that we have to catalyse that industry transformation and drive further innovation. So I think that the positive takeaway from this is that there's real potential in apartment buildings. We're consistently seeing that 30% energy reduction opportunity across the board each year that we do this program. There's some easy wins there, and there are some longer term, perhaps more difficult gains, but the opportunity is there. We just need to provide the scaffolding and the resources and the support to apartment communities to make that transformation. But you know, it's something that we're really positive about, and we're seeing quite a lot of apartment communities progressing through that journey from reducing their energy use and slowly starting to either install solar or consider the purchase of green power to progress on their journey to go renewable. Thank you.